The days after Daniel left felt longer than they should have. Emily went about her routine, sweeping the kitchen floor, tending to the small garden under its coat of frost, visiting the market, but everything seemed to echo with absence. She would catch herself setting out 2 cups in the morning before remembering she was alone. She would glance at the chair across from her at the table, only to find it empty. It was foolish, she told herself again and again. A grown woman, yearning after a man she barely knew. But the heart, she realized, didn't measure time the way the mind did. A single evening could bind 2 people closer than years of acquaintance, if only the silence between them had been filled with truth. Each night, when the wind rattled the windows, she thought of him. Was he safe? Was he lying awake as she was, restless with thoughts that wouldn't quiet? Or had she been just a passing kindness in his wandering, something small enough to forget? The uncertainty gnawed at her, pulling her into a loneliness deeper than the one she had known before. For the first time in years, she didn't just feel alone, she felt abandoned. Miles away, Daniel Walker sat at the edge of a creek, the cold water rushing beneath a thin film of ice. His horse grazed nearby, but his mind wasn't on the trail ahead or the chores waiting for him. It was on her. Emily. He remembered the way she had smiled across the breakfast table, the way her laughter had lit up her face. He remembered the quiet strength in her, the tenderness with which she had listened when no one else had. He had told himself leaving was the right thing to do, that staying would only tangle her life with his mess, his loneliness, his restlessness. She deserved better than a man who carried shadows with him wherever he went, but every mile he put between them only made the ache worse. The silence of the woods felt heavier than it had before, as though he had left a piece of himself behind in that little house with the snow-dusted window. He cursed softly under his breath and stood, pacing along the creek. He wasn't a man who second-guessed himself often, but now, with each passing day, regret gnawed at him like a hunger. Back in her home, Emily tried to distract herself with work. She baked, she mended clothes. She read until her eyes ached. But the truth was always there, lurking beneath the surface. She missed him. One evening, she found herself standing at the door, staring out into the darkness. The snow had stopped, leaving the night clear and sharp. The stars glittered above, cold and distant. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and whispered, as though the night itself might carry her words to him. "I wish you'd come back." Her voice broke on the last word, and she closed her eyes, pressing her hand to her lips. It was madness, she thought, wishing on stars, whispering to the dark. And yet, in the deepest part of her, she held on to hope. Daniel returned 3 nights later. Emily had almost convinced herself she wouldn't see him again when the knock came at her door. It was late, the fire had burned low, and she nearly didn't answer. But something in her chest told her before she even rose from her chair. It was him. Her hands trembled as she pulled open the door. And there he was. Daniel stood on the porch, snow clinging to his coat, his hair damp from the ride. His eyes met hers with a desperation she had never seen in him before. "Emily," he said, his voice low and rough. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was charged, heavy with all the words unsaid. Finally, she stepped back, her voice barely steady. "Come in." He did, shaking the snow from his shoulders, his breath still ragged from the cold. She closed the door behind him, her heart pounding so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows on the walls. Then Daniel spoke. "I tried to stay away. I thought it was better for you, for both of us. But every mile I rode, every night I sat by the fire alone. I couldn't stop thinking of you. His voice broke, raw with honesty. Emily, I don't know what's happening to me, but I know I can't pretend you don't matter. Her breath caught. She wanted to speak, but her throat tightened too. Much. All she could do was stare at him, her heart aching with a mixture of relief and fear. Daniel stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. I'm not a man who has much to offer. My life is messy. My heart, it's been broken more times than I can count. But when I was here, with you, it was the first time in years I felt whole again. Tears blurred her vision. She lifted, a trembling hand to her lips, trying to steady herself. Do you mean that? She whispered. He reached for her then, taking her hand gently in his rougher one. I've never meant anything more. Her body trembled as his words sank in, as the reality of what he was saying took root. For so long, she had lived in quiet solitude, convincing herself that love and companionship were behind her. But now, here was a man flawed, scarred, imperfect, offering her something she had thought was gone forever. Slowly, as though afraid the moment might shatter, she stepped into him. His arms came around her, pulling her against his chest. And for the first time in years, she let herself sink into the warmth of another person, her tears soaking into his coat as his hand cupped the back of her head. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence was full, not empty, carrying all the unspoken promises between them. When she finally drew back, her cheeks flushed, she managed a trembling smile. You came back. Daniel's eyes softened, his thumb brushing away a tear from her face. I don't think I could have stayed away, even if I tried. They stood together by the fire that night, talking quietly until the flames burned low. Not everything was solved, not the past that haunted him, not the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But for the first time, they weren't facing it alone. As Emily leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, she realized that sometimes love didn't arrive with fireworks or grand declarations. Sometimes it came quietly, like snow falling in the night, soft, steady, and enough to change everything when morning came. The morning light crept slowly through Emily's curtains, pale and delicate, painting the walls in soft gold. She stirred, her body heavy with the remnants of restless sleep. When her eyes opened, the first thought that rushed in wasn't of her errands or of the cold day ahead. It was of him. Daniel Walker. She sat up slowly, her hand pressing to her chest, as if to quiet the sudden flutter there. She hadn't meant to think of him so quickly, but his voice still lingered in her mind. The way he had spoken in the night, sharing pieces of himself no one else had heard. His loneliness echoed her own, and it left her feeling exposed yet. Strangely comforted, she moved to the window and pulled the curtains back. Snow had fallen again in the night, laying a fresh, soft blanket across the world. The road shimmered with frost. The branches bent under its weight. It was the kind of morning that begged for warmth, for a hearth and company. With a small breath, she tied her robe tighter and went to the kitchen. Her hands knew the rhythm by heart, setting the kettle, scooping the coffee grounds, slicing bread for toast. But today the motions felt different, charged, as if she wasn't preparing breakfast for herself alone. By the time the aroma of coffee filled the air, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, and there he was. Daniel stood in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep, his expression softer than she had ever seen. He looked almost boyish, like that, unguarded, vulnerable in a way that tugged at her heart. Good morning, he said, his voice rough with sleep. Morning, she answered, offering a faint smile. I made coffee and toast. He chuckled lightly as he stepped into the room. You didn't have to go to all that trouble. It's no trouble, she said quickly, almost too quickly. She turned back to the counter, hiding the warmth in her cheeks. They sat across from each other at the small table, steam rising from their mugs. Outside, the snow glistened in the morning sun, but inside the kitchen, it felt warmer than usual. For a while, they ate in companionable silence. Daniel bit into his toast, then shook his head with a small smile. This feels normal, comfortable, like I've been missing this for years. Emily looked up, her eyes meeting his. Me too. It was the truth, though she hadn't meant to say it aloud, but he didn't tease her for it. Instead, his smile softened, his eyes warm with something unspoken. They talked then, their voices low, weaving through small things: the weather, the quiet town, the bakery she liked in town, the old fishing spot he used to visit as a boy. And then, somehow, laughter found its way into the room. It startled Emily at first. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed so easily, so freely. The sound filled her kitchen, filling a part of her she had thought was long gone. And when she saw the way Daniel looked at her, like he was seeing not just a woman, but the spark she had buried, her heart ached with both joy and fear. But as the plates emptied and the mugs grew cold, something in him shifted. His smile faded, replaced by a shadow that dimmed the light in his eyes. I should go, he said quietly, setting his cup down. The words struck her harder than they should have. She forced a nod, though her throat tightened. Of course. You probably have things to take care of. Daniel stood slowly, pulling on his coat. I do, but more than that. He hesitated, his hand pausing on the sleeve. I don't want to overstay my welcome. You've already done more than enough for me. Emily wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that his presence hadn't been a burden but a gift. That she hadn't felt this alive, this seen, in years. But the words stayed trapped behind her lips. At the door, he turned back to her. His eyes lingered, searching her face as if trying to memorize it. Thank you, Emily, for last night, for listening. You don't know how much it meant. Her lips parted, the words stayed trembling on the tip of her tongue. But her courage failed her. All she managed was a small, wavering smile. You're welcome, Daniel. He gave a faint nod, then opened the door. The cold morning air rushed in, sharp and biting. He stepped out onto the snow-covered porch. And just like that, he was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily stood at the door long after it closed, her hand pressed against the wood, as if she could still feel the warmth of his presence. The house felt emptier than ever, the rooms echoing with absence. She wandered back to the kitchen, her eyes falling on the half-empty mug he had left behind. She touched it gently, her fingers brushing the rim as though it was something precious. A lump formed in her throat, and she sat heavily at the table, staring at the fading steam. It was foolish, she told herself. Foolish to feel this much for a man who was barely part of her life. And yet, the ache in her chest was undeniable. The day stretched on, but Emily moved through it like a ghost. She did her chores, folded the laundry, tried to read her book, but her mind kept drifting back to him. The way he had laughed, the way his voice had cracked when he spoke of loneliness, the way he had looked at her across the table as though she was more than just a woman filling the silence. By evening, the house seemed unbearably quiet. She sat by the window, staring at the snowflakes drifting lazily from the sky. In her hands, she held her knitting needles, though the yarn remained untouched. Her thoughts were too restless, her heart too full. She thought of how easily he had slipped into her morning, how natural it had felt to pour coffee for him, to share laughter over toast. It had felt like a glimpse of something she had long given up on. A simple quiet companionship that filled the emptiness in ways nothing else had. And now, with him gone, the ache of that absence pressed on her, until her chest hurt. Emily pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window and whispered to herself, "Why does it feel like something's missing, when it was never really mine to begin with?" She didn't know the answer. All she knew was that Daniel Walker had walked out her door, leaving behind a silence that felt sharper, heavier than before. And deep down, though she wouldn't admit it aloud, she hoped desperately that this wasn't the end of their story. The house had gone still, but Emily couldn't sleep. She had been lying in bed for nearly an hour, listening to the steady tick of the old clock on the dresser, waiting for the drowsiness that never came. The blankets felt heavy, the pillow restless. Beneath her head, it wasn't the wind outside, nor the creak of the old house that kept her awake. It was him. Daniel Walker was asleep, or so she thought, on her couch in the living room. A man she barely knew. A man who had knocked on her door out of the cold, shivering, tired, asking for help. She had opened her home to him, because it was the decent thing to do. That's all. And yet, her thoughts refused to let go. She pictured his face when she first opened the door, the tired eyes, the snow melting in his hair, the way his smile carried more sadness than warmth. Something about that expression had stayed with her, lingering in the quiet of her room. She turned onto her side and pressed her cheek against the pillow, telling herself it was foolish. He'll be gone tomorrow. You'll both forget this night happened. But her heart didn't believe her. It beat faster with every thought of him, as though something inside her had been woken from a long sleep. Finally, she gave up. With a soft sigh, she pushed back the blankets, slid into her robe, and padded barefoot down the hall. A glass of water, she told herself. Just that. Maybe then her thoughts would settle. But when she entered the dimly lit living room, she froze. Daniel wasn't asleep. He was sitting upright on the couch, elbows resting on his knees, staring out the window as if the night sky held answers. The blanket she'd given him was pulled around his waist, his shoulders tense. The lamplight caught the shadows under his eyes, making him look older, worn in a way that went beyond tiredness. Emily hesitated, suddenly uncertain if she should interrupt. But the weight in his posture, the quiet heaviness he carried, pulled her closer. Her voice came out softer than she intended. "Can't sleep?" He turned his head quickly, startled, then gave a faint, rueful smile. "Not really. Too many thoughts, I guess." Emily nodded, filling a glass of water at the sink. She should have gone back to her room, let him have his solitude. Instead, she found herself carrying the glass back and lowering into the armchair across from him. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It felt strange but safe, like they had both been waiting for a moment like this without realizing it. Daniel broke it first. His voice was low, almost like a confession. "I used to think I knew exactly what I wanted. The city, the job, the money. I chased it all, convinced that if I worked hard enough, it would make sense. And for a while, it did." He paused, his fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. "But then I'd come home at the end of the day, and there was nothing waiting for me. No one. Just silence." Emily's heart stirred. The way he said it, soft and raw, made her chest tighten. "Loneliness," she whispered. His eyes lifted to hers, surprised. "Yes, that's it. Exactly." She should have left it there, but the honesty in his voice drew her in. For so long, she had kept her own scars hidden, even from herself. Yet now, in the quiet of her living room, with this man looking at her as though he understood, she felt her guard slip. "I know that feeling," she said softly. "I thought I had everything. Once. A marriage, a home, plans for a family. But it all came apart. He left, and when he did, her voice faltered. It was like everything I believed about my life cracked in two. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't look away. He simply listened. Really listened in a way no one had in years. And that made her keep going. I filled the emptiness, however. I could. Books. Routines. Chores. Little things that made the days seem full. But some nights, she stopped, her throat tight. Some nights, the silence is louder than anything else. For a moment, neither of them moved. Their words hung in the air between them, fragile but binding. Then Daniel leaned back, exhaling a shaky breath. You're the first person I've told any of this to. Isn't it strange? That I'd come back here, break down in the cold, knock on your door, and end up spilling everything I've kept locked inside for years. Emily's lips curved into the faintest smile. Maybe it's easier with someone who doesn't expect anything from you. His gaze deepened, searching hers. Do you? The question struck harder than she expected. Did she expect anything? From him? Logic told her no. He was just a guest for one night. A man passing through her life. But her heart whispered something else, trembling and unspoken. I don't know, she admitted. And it was the truest thing she could have said. The clock ticked loudly on the mantel. The fire in the stove crackled faintly. And in that silence, something shifted. Their eyes met, and in that look was an understanding words could never capture, an echo of loneliness, of hope, of something both fragile and powerful. Emily felt it stir inside her like a spark. Dangerous. Beautiful. Daniel was the first to pull away, a small smile tugging at his lips. It's late. You should get some rest. I've already kept you up too long. She nodded, though every part of her wanted to stay a little longer. Good night, Daniel. Good night, Emily. She rose slowly, her steps reluctant as she made her way back to her bedroom. At the doorway, she turned one last time. He was leaning back on the couch, eyes closed, but his expression was softer now, like speaking had lifted something heavy from his shoulders. Emily lingered a moment, her heart aching with something she couldn't name, then slipped back into her room. She lay awake long into the night. His words were playing in her mind. Loneliness. Silence. Too many thoughts. For the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely alone. And for the first time in years, she was afraid of what that might mean. The evening had settled in quietly. The kind of night that made the world outside feel like a painting left unfinished. A pale moon hovered over the Vermont hills, its silver light washing over the snow-dusted trees. Inside her little house at the edge of town, Emily Carter tucked the last book back onto its shelf and sighed. The day had been long, filled with the usual chores and the silence she had grown so accustomed to over the years. She had lived alone since the divorce. At first, she had thought the quiet would be unbearable, but she had learned how to fill it with soft music, with books, with the sound of her own thoughts. Some evenings, like this one, she convinced herself she had grown comfortable. Yet deep down, there was always a dull ache, a whisper of loneliness she tried not to listen to. She made her way to the window and pulled the curtains closed against the wind that rattled the glass. Winter was always harsher here, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, thinking how grateful she was for the warmth of her little home. Just as she was about to settle into her favorite chair with a novel, it happened. A knock at the door. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night, it felt like thunder. Emily froze. She never had visitors this late. Her heart gave a nervous flutter. For a moment she stood perfectly still, trying to decide if she should even answer. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she had imagined it. But then it came again, firmer this time. 3 clear raps against the wooden door. Curiosity battled with caution as she walked slowly toward the entryway. She flicked on the porch light, and, through the frosted glass, she saw the outline of a man. When she opened the door, the cold air rushed in, biting against her skin. And there he stood, Daniel Walker. Her breath caught, though she quickly tried to steady herself. She knew him, though only faintly. Daniel was the son of her neighbor, Mrs. Walker, who lived 2 streets over. Emily remembered meeting him once, or twice, years ago, when he had returned briefly to help his mother with the house. But he hadn't stayed long. Most of what she knew came from second-hand stories. How he had gone off to the city, chasing work and opportunities. How he rarely came back except for short visits. Tonight, however, he didn't look like the ambitious man who had once driven away in a polished car. He looked tired, worn down. His coat was dusted with snow, his dark hair damp, his face pale. His eyes, a deep shade of blue that seemed darker in the porch light, carried something Emily couldn't quite name. Exhaustion, perhaps, or something heavier. "Emily," he said softly, almost apologetically. "I'm sorry to bother you. My car broke down just down the road. I didn't know where else to go." For a second, she didn't answer. Her mind raced with thoughts. Why her house? Why not his mother's? But she remembered that Mrs. Walker had moved recently to live with her sister in Maine. The old house stood empty now. Emily studied him in the light. There was no mistaking the slight tremor in his hands, the way his shoulders sagged beneath the heavy coat. He looked as though he had been walking in the cold for too long. "Come in before you freeze," she said finally, stepping aside. He gave her a small, grateful nod and walked in. The warmth of the house wrapped around him, and he let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. Emily closed the door and turned to him. "Sit down. You look frozen." He obeyed, lowering himself onto the couch with a heaviness that suggested more than just physical exhaustion. She fetched a blanket from the nearby chair and handed it to him. Their fingers brushed briefly as he took it, and the small contact sent an unexpected jolt through her. She quickly pulled her hand back, hoping he hadn't noticed. "Thank you," he murmured, pulling the blanket around his shoulders. Emily nodded, still studying him. The Daniel Walker she remembered from years ago had been tall, confident, almost intimidating in the way young men sometimes were when they thought the world belonged to them. This Daniel looked older not just in years but in spirit. His face bore faint lines at the corners of his eyes, and his expression carried a weight she couldn't quite identify. "Do you want some tea?" she asked, trying to fill the silence. He smiled faintly. "That would be nice, actually." In the kitchen, she busied herself with boiling water, her thoughts tumbling one over the other. Why here? Why now? And why did she feel this strange pull toward him, this quiet need to understand the story behind his eyes? When she returned with the steaming mug, he accepted it gratefully, wrapping his hands around it as if soaking up every bit of warmth. He sipped slowly, then leaned back against the couch. "I really didn't mean to trouble you," he said after a pause. "I thought I could make it to the inn on Main Street, but the car gave out right at the corner. And walking back in this cold, it wasn't a smart idea." "It's no trouble," Emily said quickly. "The couch is comfortable enough. You can stay here tonight." Her own words surprised her. She had never been the type to open her home so easily, not since she had started living alone. But there was something about the way he looked lost, yet dignified, that made her want to offer shelter. He smiled then, and it was small but genuine. "I appreciate it, more than you know." The room fell into a gentle quiet. The clock ticked softly on the mantel. The fire in the small stove crackled faintly. And for the first time in a long while, Emily didn't feel the loneliness pressing in from the wall's dot as she stood there. Watching him settle into the couch, she told herself, it was only for one night. Just kindness. Just decency. But deep down, she felt it, the subtle stirring of something unexpected, something she couldn't quite name. And when his tired eyes lifted to meet hers, offering a silent gratitude that words could never capture, a warmth spread through her chest. A warmth she hadn't felt in years. Emily didn't know then that this night, this simple choice to let him sleep on her couch was about to alter the quiet rhythm of her life in ways she never imagined.